afternoon. I'm Barb Conrad from the Rotary Club of Wapaka. This session is titled Asylum and the Changing Face of Immigration. This presentation addresses migration across the southern border and resources devoted to border security since 1992. Stories of individual asylum seekers Kat Griffith has known and worked with, a brief tour of a border camp, tent court, and deportation flight as witnessed in early 2020. An overview of immigration since 2023, including executive orders under both Presidents Biden and Trump. The presentation explores incentives and realities that drive migrant decision-making and policy trade-offs and impact of recent executive orders. Note that the session ends at 4:20. If you have questions, our speakers would like you to wait till the end. According to the schedule, I think we're done at 4:40?
4:40.
Yes, okay. The script is wrong. I noticed that right away. Quick reminder to silence your devices, and we are starting on time, and we will end on time. Our presenter for this session is Kat Griffith. Kat has given versions of this presentation to a wide variety of audiences, including churches, retired educators, college classes, civic and political organizations, Ripon College's Center for Politics and the People, WisconsinEye, and the National Office and Immigration Working Group of the League of Women Voters. Her background includes a number of years living and working in Latin America, many years as a Spanish-English interpreter for immigrants and asylum seekers, and a background in public policy, economics, and communications. She has been active on immigration policy since the 1980s and is currently a Fond du Lac County Board Supervisor and is committed to bipartisan and respectful dialogue across political differences. Please welcome Kat.
Thank you so much. It is really an honor to be here. I'm grateful to the people from Ripon who helped make this happen. David Sacrison is here, and Nita Krenz just came in back there. I want to say that although I'm not a Rotarian, I consider myself a dedicated FOR, friend of Rotarians. My husband and I have hosted a number of Rotary exchange students. I love the work that the organization does, so I'm really delighted to be here. I will say that the introduction included something that I wrote a while back. There's been so much activity politically and sort of policy-wise in immigration that I left out the part about the tent camps at the border and the deportation flights and stuff, because it just felt like there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's happened since then. So, alas, I had to leave that out. So, let me tell you what we're going to cover today. We're going to start with definitions: migrant, immigrant, refugee, asylum seeker. Then I'm going to show you some data, basically a data dump of migration and border security from about 1990 to about 2023. Then I'm going to tell you some stories of some people, asylum seekers that I have known. And then we're going to cover some recent immigration trends and policies, focusing on the last year of the Biden administration and what's been happening under Trump since then. And then we're going to end with towards a better national conversation. So let me start here. First, definitions. A migrant is someone on the move seeking a new place to live. An immigrant is someone who has become a resident of another country and who intends to remain. A refugee is someone who has fled their home for reasons of violence or persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion. They must generally obtain formal refugee status or humanitarian parole before arriving in the United States. And an asylum seeker is someone who may qualify for refugee status, but seeks to obtain it after arriving to the US. And there's a reason that you'll hear about later why we need to keep that option open. Before I move on, are there any quick questions or clarifications about these definitions? Okay, good. Okay. So this first slide shows Border Patrol staffing. And before I jump in, I want to explain why I'm showing you this old data when there's so much new news to share. The reason is that the actions being taken by the Trump administration rest on a certain narrative about migration. And some important parts of that narrative are challenged by this data. I think it's important to understand where we've been in order to understand the present moment. So the first thing to notice on this graph is that staffing has gone up steadily since 1992 under both Republican and Democratic administrations. If you look across the bottom, it goes by years there. There's no obvious alternating pattern. The second thing to notice is that the staffing actually peaked in this graph under Obama. It came down a little under Trump. It reached a new peak under Biden, which actually goes off of this graph, and it has now since then reached an even higher peak under the Trump administration. So there's been a very substantial and sustained increase over many, many years. The final thing I'll say is that despite rhetoric to the contrary, there has historically been no meaningful difference between the parties in terms of the border staffing. This is the Border Patrol budget. Like the previous graph, this reflects a bipartisan commitment to spending on Border Patrol. In real terms, adjusted for inflation, we were spending 8 times more in 2021 than we were in 1990. Cost per apprehension soared from about $656 per apprehension in 2000 to almost $11,000 in 2018. Adjusting for inflation, we're spending over 11 times more per apprehension in 2018 than 2000. How much is it worth to us to keep people out? This slide shows apprehensions at the US-Mexico border. This graph actually starts in 1980. The first thing to say is, if just throwing more money and more agents at the border would bring numbers of apprehensions down, we'd see a pretty smooth downward slope, but we don't. The second thing is, there's no obvious partisan pattern here either. The highest point on this graph prior to the Biden administration was actually under Reagan in 1986. The lowest point was in the aftermath of the Great Recession. During that time, about 1 million more immigrants left than came in. That was under Obama. The last thing I want to say is there's more to these numbers than meet the eye. So one of the things that's driven the numbers up in recent years is that many people started turning themselves into Customs and Border Protection. They were not trying to evade capture at all. They were turning themselves in to ask for asylum. Your apprehension numbers go up when people are throwing themselves at you. Another thing that affected these numbers is that under the Title 42 expulsion policy during the pandemic, we weren't punishing migrants for trying again. So lots tried multiple times. So you had not necessarily that many more people at the border, but you had people trying many times. Another thing that has a huge impact on these numbers is the conditions in sending countries. These are largely beyond our control, and they play a huge role in how many people come and where they come from. Right now, there are more reasons to come and more places to come from than at any point in several generations. The main thing is that how hard we try to stop them, which drives a lot of the conversation at the national level, is just one variable among many, and it's probably not the most important one. The final graph I'm going to show you here is one showing the demographic change in who's coming. If you look at this graph, you'll see that back in 2019, all that blue area, that's at the very beginning of the graph, that's all the people coming from Mexico and the Northern Triangle. The Northern Triangle includes Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. So you see that the vast majority, 90% of the migrants back in 2019 were coming from Mexico and the Northern Triangle. By 2023, only half were. Okay, so this was a big change. Nearly half of all migrants, many claiming asylum in the last couple of years, have been coming from China, Turkey, Russia, India, Haiti, Venezuela, Colombia, Nicaragua, Cuba, and other countries. We cannot simply deport people back to many of these countries. Some refuse to take them back. And even if we could send them back, how many of us would want to deport someone who fled Russia or Haiti or Venezuela right now? So to sum up where we are, I'm kind of focusing on the end of 2023 here, which was really kind of a historic moment of immigration to this country. Multiple historic highs, arrivals and apprehensions, Among those arrivals and apprehensions were many, many women, children, and families. This is different. Used to be, 20 years ago, you had a lot of single men of working age. Now you have a lot of whole families, and they are fleeing for very different reasons. The number of sending countries and the reasons to flee is at a historic high. Wars, dictatorships, climate disasters, failed states. More people are on the move around the world right now than at any time since the end of World War II. Our policies were not adapted to this reality. Another historic high is the number of migrants seeking asylum. That wasn't really a thing 15 years ago. I mean, a few people did, but it wasn't really a big thing. Now, it's a huge portion of the people coming to the border, at least in recent history. They were turning themselves into Customs and Border Patrol when they arrived. This wasn't a law enforcement situation. They were not seeking to evade capture. This was a humanitarian situation. More guards didn't help because the migrants weren't evading guards, they were seeking them out. Another historic high was releases to pursue asylum. This actually was starting under Trump and it was continuing under Biden. There weren't and aren't many legal alternatives. We don't have detention space for everyone. We can't deport them to countries that won't take them back. We can't just dump them in other countries, and our own asylum laws prohibit us from simply expelling them if they can pass a credible threat interview. So in recent years, many were released into the country to apply for asylum. Another historic high was resources devoted to Border Patrol and detention. Migrant detentions at an all-time high in absolute terms. By the end of the Biden administration, we had about 42,000 detention beds. They were full. There are more now, and they are also full. Expulsions and deportations were at an all-time high. We hear that Biden didn't do anything. Well, he did a lot his last year, and we'll get to that. And the final thing I'll mention is that by the start of 2024, there was a historic backlog of asylum cases, 1.6 million pending, with wait times of about 4 years. This backlog had real consequences. With the prospect of 4 years in the United States to wait, more people were motivated to try for asylum, even if they had very poor prospects of success. Clearing the backlog and significantly shortening the wait time would probably have discouraged many people with poor prospects, but that's not where we put our resources. So that was a lot of statistics. I'm going to help put some numbers, some faces on these numbers. So I'm going to remind you again of what asylum seekers are. So according to our 1980 asylum law and international law, asylum seekers are those fleeing persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. I'm focusing a lot of this talk on asylum seekers because in recent years they were such a large share of the total number of migrants coming to the US, and they posed some new policy challenges for us. I'd like to clarify that until Biden's executive orders, which set up the CBP One app, that's the Customs and Border Protection One app, and the migrant processing centers in several countries, the only ways to seek asylum were to request it at a point of entry, where it was often summarily denied, or to cross the border illegally and request asylum from a CBP agent. Those were the ways to do it. You couldn't do it outside the country. I'm going to talk briefly about several asylum seekers that I've known. To keep this presentation short, I'm going to focus on just 4 of them. The first 2 households I met in the tent camp in Matamoros in 2020. The third is a family whose initial testimony I took and translated, and the 4th was recently granted asylum and currently lives with me and my husband. They all gave me permission to share their stories. So the first one, that picture, by the way, was the tent camp in Matamoros, just across the border from Brownsville. The first one is a Salvadoran. So the woman you see there was a police officer, and I think she was a good one because she wound up in the sights of Salvadoran gangs. She and her family were repeatedly threatened. They moved to another neighborhood, and she kept doing her job, and a new gang started threatening them. She kept on doing her job and was threatened again, and they moved to a third neighborhood, and then their friends started threatening them, and they realized that the gangs were threatening their friends and saying, if you don't get them to stop, we're going to go after you too. At that point, they realized they needed to flee. They did flee the country, and in the chaos of that trip, she and her husband were separated. Her husband and daughter were allowed into the United States to seek asylum, and she was left to languish at the border. She was going through the process. At the time, it took 9 to 12 months for an average person to go from their first asylum, their first appointment to the final hearing, and she had been there for the better part of a year. I'm going to take a brief detour and address the question of why are there gangs in El Salvador? A lot of people don't know this story. Because so many asylum seekers from Central America have been fleeing gang violence, I think it's important to understand. So scholars trace the problem back to the Salvadoran Civil War of the 1980s, in which thousands of young men fleeing forced conscription sought asylum in the United States. I had a volunteer job translating affidavits from Salvadoran asylum seekers in Boston during the early 80s, so I heard all about what they were running from. Only 4% of the migrants fleeing El Salvador were given asylum. Many of the rest struggled to establish themselves. According to researchers, some who were living on the streets of LA were preyed upon by existing gangs, and they banded together for self-protection. Some of them wound up in prison, where they turned into hardened criminal gang members. When their prison terms were up, we deported them back to El Salvador. At that time, Central America had no gangs. But the cancer that was born in our own prisons, among people who fled violence we paid for, whose asylum claims we denied, metastasized into a transnational criminal enterprise. The gangs quickly took over large parts of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, the infamous Northern Triangle. And now we are reaping what we sowed, a third-generation ripple effect of our decisions during the 1980s. The families fleeing gang violence in Central America are showing up at our border, again seeking asylum from the very country that many of us believe bears some responsibility for their plight. The second story is a Honduran story. This man also and his family fled gang violence, and he also was separated from his wife and son during flight, and his wife and son were also allowed into the United States for their asylum application, and he wound up waiting at the border. While he was waiting, he and his daughter were kidnapped. They were held in a warehouse for about a week before they were able to pull together a ransom from relatives in Honduras. And during that week, they missed their ICE appointment. The judge canceled their application, and they were starting all over again, hoping that they would have success. The third story is a Guatemalan story. I know this one kind of intimately. The story started when Omar, who is the man you see there, the dad, when Omar's two younger brothers went out to buy a soccer ball and never returned. Their disappearance was reported and nothing was done. After a social media post asking if anyone knew anything about their whereabouts, Omar's mother started receiving threatening calls demanding ransom. She paid the first demand and immediately got another, which she couldn't pay. The callers sent her pictures of headless, tortured bodies to get her to pay up. The calls didn't stop until it was clear that she was unable to pay another ransom. Again, the police did nothing. 2 weeks later, the bodies of the boys were discovered, tortured and mutilated, in cardboard boxes in a ravine in Guatemala City. A few days later, a man claiming to be a police investigator on the case did an in-depth interview with Omar. 2 days later, the whole story with all the identifying details, including the interview which the investigator had surreptitiously recorded, was posted on multiple social media sites. It turned out he was a lying journalist, not a police officer at all. Omar begged him to take down the posts, but he refused. I'm leaving out a lot of details here, but repeated visits to the police netted no protection and no action. Things finally came to a head when Omar's father and Omar were threatened that they would be next if the family didn't call off the police investigation. A couple of housebound and sleepless weeks later, Omar and his wife decided to seek asylum in the United States. They waited in Tijuana for many weeks while they sought a preliminary asylum hearing using the CBP One app. This Customs and Border Protection app was created under Biden to give people a way to apply for asylum without crossing the border illegally first. They eventually gained an appointment, which netted them permission to remain in the country while they pursued their asylum claim. The family is now living in Wisconsin. They have the legal right under our laws to be here while they wait for their asylum claim to be adjudicated. However, under the new presidential administration, their circumstances are precarious. I'll return to their story later. My final story here is a South American story. This last story is about a woman I will call Laura. I'm going to share a very partial and abbreviated version of her story. In her home country, her family was preyed upon by an armed guerrilla group that killed her grandfather, a cousin, and a brother, and kidnapped her and two of her other brothers. They also ran the entire family off their land, forcing them to relocate to another part of the country. One of the reasons they were targeted was because they refused to grow coca or collaborate with the group's drug business. Here's a brief quote from her statement. "I'm a nursing assistant. In 2022, the armed group kidnapped me, and I was forced for about 6 months to serve as a nurse for them and other kidnapped people like me. During that time, I witnessed many terrible things. I ended up so affected that I now have PTSD. I was lucky to get out of that place alive, but I had great fear that at any moment the group would find me. So I had to leave my country. I didn't want to live the rest of my life with that fear." When Laura arrived in the United States and explained why she had come, she was put in ICE detention while her asylum claim was processed. She spent over 19 months in 3 different jails. During that time, she experienced a number of incidents of abuse, including one that caused serious and probably permanent injury and resulted in her being confined to a wheelchair for the last 9 months of her imprisonment. A judge granted Laura asylum in December 2024, and she came to live with my husband and me. Her doctor believes that with 12 to 18 additional months of intensive PT, she can make a substantial but probably not complete recovery. No one in ICE was ever held accountable for what happened to her, and they refused to release medical or other records. I'd like to pause here for a moment and just give you a chance to digest these stories and honor those who've lived them with a moment of silence. Thank you. Now I'm going to fast forward, switch gears again, to the end of 2023. So in December of 2023, there were 250,000 to 300,000 apprehensions at the border. That was an all-time high. There were days where there were more than 10,000 showing up in a single day. Again, this was a humanitarian crisis more than a law enforcement crisis. People were turning themselves in, and the Customs and Border Patrol officials were so busy dealing with the people already in their custody that they sometimes just had to close the border because they had no more people to staff it. This graph, if you look at the top line, it shows you what happened during the last year of the Biden presidency. Oh, I'm sorry. Whoops. What happened here? Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. Sorry. So if you look at the top line shows 2024, okay? And you can see that there's a pretty steady downward, well, not that steady, but it's a consistent downward trend in the number of encounters by month. And then if you look at the bottom line, it continues out that previous one and keeps on going down. And that shows basically to the end of the Biden administration's administration. So that's where Joe Biden took action. In the last year that he was in office, he passed several executive orders that made some big changes. I could tell you about his measures, but in the interests of time, I'm just going to show you the results so that we have time to focus on some of the new measures taken under President Trump. So the results are that there was an enormous decline in apprehensions during 2024. By July, illegal border crossings were down by 77% from December. It was the lowest level in 4 years. And those allowed to seek asylum also declined radically. By July, it was just 1/16 as many as in December. So the results of Biden's orders, which in my opinion included a mix of the good, the bad, and the ugly, were that there was this huge decline in arrivals and apprehensions and permissions to seek asylum. By the end of his term, the numbers were comparable to the numbers last seen near the end of the Great Recession. And it's important to realize that a lot of the drop in migration through the southern border actually happened in the last year of his administration, though the new administration has continued to bring it down even further. Okay, so now I'm at President Trump's policies. He has enacted over 30 executive orders dealing with immigration. I'm going to talk about just a handful of them, focusing mainly on the ones that you might not have heard about that I think are particularly important. The first one is halting refugee admissions completely. That includes those who are already approved for resettlement, including about 15,000 Afghans, most of whom collaborated with the United States and now face mortal danger from the Taliban. Several organizations have sued the administration, and the Ninth Circuit Court recently ordered the government to process and settle the more than 100,000 refugees already approved by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. However, since then, the Trump administration terminated cooperative agreements with the agencies that do refugee resettlement under contract with the government. In effect, despite the court ruling, the president's initial refugee ban remains largely in place. Courts have ordered resumption, but there's a lot of sand in the gears by now. And in the meantime, paperwork has expired for many refugees who were approved and in the pipeline. Will they have to start over? Will they get to start over? I've been in conversation with World Relief, which does refugee resettlement in Wisconsin's Fox Valley and elsewhere. They've had to cut staff and services substantially, despite the fact that they have many refugees to service from the last months of the Biden administration. Another one of his executive orders is expanding deportation targets. It used to be that we would pretty much prioritize people who had committed crimes, and under recent administrations, that's been standard policy, that if somebody without documented status commits a crime, they are deported. Particularly in northern cities right now, enforcement efforts are broad and do not target those with criminal records. For example, in Boston, only about 1 in 8 immigrants taken into custody has a record. In New York, it's 1 in 15. Now that temporary protected status, TPS, has been canceled for 500,000 Cubans, Venezuelans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans, they are also deportable, even those who've lived here for decades. A judge has temporarily halted this. However, the deportations of those with various legal statuses, combined with the lack of due process for many, has led to widespread fear in the broader immigrant community. It's not clear anymore who, if anyone, is safe. Another recent policy is to define immigration enforcement as a primary mission of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, that is a sprawling organization. It does many, many things to safeguard the security of the United States. It has historically had a broad mandate to address things like human trafficking, drug smuggling, child sexual abuse, and other complex crimes. Focusing on immigration enforcement as kind of the primary thing means taking resources away from fighting crime to focusing on deporting people, many of whom have committed no crime and pose no threat. An example of what this means: fentanyl is killing a lot of Americans. It's also largely unrelated to migration. Almost all of it comes into the country in shipments of goods. Spending more on stopping migrants fleeing dictators and deporting more nursing home aides means less money available to fight threats like fentanyl. Another policy is to end the catch and release policy of giving people permission to apply for asylum and basically, once they've been here 6 months, be able to get a work permit and sort of live an ordinary life while they're waiting for their claim to be adjudicated. Instead of doing that, we are now trying to hold them all in detention. So the Trump administration is committed to building 4 new 10,000-bed facilities and 14 smaller sites, plus Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. We have also rendered detainees to El Salvador. CBP claims to be detaining everyone they catch and holding them until ICE takes them. It's worth thinking about the costs of this policy. In 2018, that's the most recent data that I have, it cost $134 a day for an adult to be in ICE detention. It was $319 a day for a mother with children, and it was $775 a day per unaccompanied child. Ankle bracelet monitoring costs about $8 a day. We have to ask ourselves, is detention on a massive scale how we want to spend our money? How much safer will this extraordinary investment actually make us, especially given that so many of those being rounded up have no record of criminal activity? Another measure is halting the CBP-1 app. It was one of Biden's signature efforts. Now those who entered lawfully under this program, following all our rules, are being threatened with removal. Processing of their cases is in limbo, and they are vulnerable to deportation despite the fact that they are here lawfully and followed all our laws to come in. Terminating humanitarian parole is another policy. Humanitarian parole is a status that recognizes the difficult conditions that a lot of migrants have fled. It gives people a chance to apply for refugee or asylee or other legal status from within the United States. So, for example, many Afghans were admitted to the US on humanitarian parole. During our chaotic retreat from Afghanistan, there was no time to do the extensive vetting that refugees receive before they're allowed into the country. Humanitarian parole gave them a chance to apply for refugee status once they got here. They still had to prove a lot. They still had to go through a lot of vetting, but they could do it once they got here. The Guatemalan family that I told you about, who entered lawfully through the CBP-1 app, was recently told that they had had their parole terminated. I'm going to read to you some excerpts from the letter they received 2 weeks ago from the Department of Homeland Security. 4/11/2025, notice of termination of parole. It is time for you to leave the United States. DHS is now exercising its discretion to terminate your parole. Unless it expires sooner, your parole will terminate 7 days from the date of this notice. That was last week. If you do not depart the United States immediately, you will be subject to potential law enforcement actions that will result in your removal from the United States. You will be subject to potential criminal prosecution, civil fines and penalties, and any other lawful options available to the federal government. Do not attempt to remain in the United States. The federal government will find you. Their lawyer assures them that they are here lawfully and that this letter is intimidation pure and simple. However, given the unlawful deportations and violations of due process of recent weeks, the family has made arrangements to have their affairs and their children taken care of in the event anyone is taken into custody. The final one that I'm going to mention here is immigrant registration. This was a new rule that came into effect on April 11th. All non-citizens over the age of 14 must be registered with the government. Not registering, being caught without proof of registration, or not notifying the government within 10 days of moving threatens individuals with criminal prosecution, fines, jail time, and deportation. The President has instructed federal prosecutors to make enforcing this a priority. This law will apply to millions of immigrants, lawful immigrants, treating them as if they pose a threat. A lawsuit filed against this new order points out that first, there was no time or plan for notifying the millions of people affected, and second, it will impact not only non-citizens, but anyone suspected of being a non-citizen. From here on out, effectively, any immigrant of any status, including naturalized citizens, will pretty much need to carry immigration documents at all times to prove they are registered, since not having proof is itself a criminal offense. I want to reiterate that these are just a few of the dozens of executive orders and actions taken by the President that touch on immigration. So, what are the results so far? Border apprehensions decreased by 93% during the first 11 days of President Trump's administration from an already low point. They're now comparable to apprehensions during the Great Recession, and those were at the lowest levels in at least 45 years. Right now, we are as far from an invasion at the southern border as we have been in a couple of generations. There is now essentially no opportunity to seek asylum in the US, and fewer trying. The virtual impossibility of seeking asylum is a violation of our asylum law, which has not been repealed by Congress. Trump deported about 38,000 people his first month back in office. This is comparable to the rate of deportations and removals under Obama. Biden's monthly average of deportations and expulsions was 57,000, including mostly either people who had just entered the country or individuals already in custody for committing a crime. Those expulsions were easier and cheaper than what Trump is planning to do, which includes costly workplace raids and rounding up of individuals not already in custody. It's important to understand that for both Democratic and Republican administrations in recent years, they've been removing undocumented immigrants taken into custody for crimes. What Trump is doing differently is aggressively going after those with no criminal charges or convictions. He's also going after those who are here with permission, such as those who've been given permission to apply for asylum. Let's see. It's worth noting that with resources devoted to policing the border at a new high and apprehensions at a very low level, the cost per apprehension at the border is probably the highest it's ever been. Apprehensions in the interior of the country have always been expensive. Overall, Trump's measures have laid the groundwork for a sustained increase in overall expulsions. Whether the American people ultimately like the methods, the results, or the cost remains to be seen. Before we get to the end, I want to address two big questions that lots of people ask. The first is, why don't they just come legally? So this graph will show you why. According to a 2018 Gallup poll, which I'm sure is quite outdated now, but in 2018, about 158 million people worldwide thought they would like to immigrate to the United States. That's that big stripe across the top. About 32 million people began the formal process, the legal process to do so in 2021. Of those, that would be the green and yellow that you see there. Of those, about 24 million were applying for work visas, that's the green, and about 8 million applied for family reunification visas, that's the yellow. And then there's a little strip of refugees, that was 200,000. Of those 24 million workers, 200,000 got visas. That's 1 out of every 120. Of the 8 million family members, 700,000 got visas. That's fewer than 9%. That year, we also let in 20,000 refugees out of the 200,000 or so that applied. If you are facing dangerous and desperate circumstances at home, and you know that you can find safety and work and perhaps family members in the United States, if you can just get there, why would you wait in line for less than a 1% chance or a 40-year wait? We set up the incentives that drive migrant behavior. We could choose to do it better. Wait times for family reunification visas, another issue. The main point here is that the wait times range from long, like 15 to 30 years, to several multiples of the human lifespan. Final question, why don't those who are already here apply for legal status? The truth is, there is no current legal path to status for most who are here without permission. Reagan's 1986 amnesty, which covered 2.9 million people, was the last time we gave a path to permanent legal status to a significant number of those without it. DACA covers about 500,000, has a very uncertain future. The alternative is to return home and join the queue. You know what that looks like. So where do we go from here? I'm here because it's my hope that a better national conversation could eventually lead to better policies. What I mean by a good conversation is one that starts where people are at, acknowledging and addressing our fears, our concerns, our values, and our goals. We have every right as a country to build an immigration policy that reflects our values and is in our national self-interest. A good conversation recognizes that both parties got us to where we are today, and it's going to take both parties to get us to a better place. A good conversation addresses honestly today's facts on the ground, which are frankly not addressed well by yesterday's policies. By the way, this picture is of a police precinct in Chicago where migrants are camped out on the floor of the lobby. This was a result of Texas Governor Greg Abbott's policy of shipping migrants to northern cities. I actually think he did us a bit of a favor in some respects by forcing a conversation about who bears the costs and reaps the benefits of our poorly designed immigration system. I didn't like his commitment to ensuring that the process was chaotic and cruel. It was. But he was right that border states were bearing an unfair burden from our policy dysfunction. It's high time that we talked about how to handle immigration in a way that treats migrants with respect and dignity, shares the costs fairly, and brings us maximum benefit as a nation. I would like to end with a quote from Ronald Reagan. "We lead the world because, unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength, from every country and every corner of the world. And by doing so, we continuously renew and enrich our nation. Thanks to each wave of new arrivals to this land of opportunity, we're a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas, always on the cutting edge, always leading the world to the next frontier. This quality is vital to our future as a nation. If we ever closed the door to new Americans, our leadership in the world would soon be lost." I will end there and open it up to comments and questions. Yes, sir.
Are you at risk for yourself for harboring refugees?
She has legal status. The question is, am I at personal risk for harboring a refugee in my house? She's an asylee, and I don't believe that I'm at risk because she is here with legal status. It was granted by a judge. That doesn't mean that something won't happen. It could. Lots of things are happening right now, so I don't assume that nothing will happen, but I think we're prepared if something were to happen.
Immigration has become such a polarized and just, awful topic with so many people, and I love how you come at it from both sides and really try to speak to both parties. Have you had experience presenting to people who thought they were going to be really against what you were sharing and then had a different change? Have you seen hearts being changed by some of the information you shared?
Well, what I can say is that I don't know what's in people's hearts when they come into the room because I talk to a lot of strangers. I've talked to a lot of very mixed groups. I have no idea where you all are. I assume this is a mixed group. And I have never had a hostile response. I've had, on the contrary, I've had one of the most mixed groups, I think, that I did. They asked me at the end spontaneously, is there anything we can do? And I will make this announcement now too. I have a sheet here, just a few copies of a flyer of some organizations that would love to help and need funds. And I will put in a particular word for World Relief right now, since they're doing a good job settling a lot of refugees. And I told them that I would put in a plug for them. But if anybody would like to help out, I've got a sheet up here that you can take. Oh, do you want to handle the questions?
Yeah.
Got it.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing this information. And you kind of alluded to that with the reference to the resources that we could, as Rotarians, provide some funding. Is there anything else, knowing Rotarians as you do, is there anything else that you would recommend that we do to help with this situation?
Well, I think that you already do a wonderful thing in hosting a lot of exchange students and bringing a little bit of the rest of the world to your members. And I would encourage you to keep on doing that. And if you want to have more Rotary groups, invite me to give this talk and invite other people to join you, not just Rotarians, because I think a lot of you have a more global perspective already. I think for a lot of people, they just don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. I've lived 7 years in Latin America, and I've lived overseas elsewhere too. And I think for a lot of people who don't have that experience, the stories are just shocking and impactful. So help me spread that word.
I read a recent article that if everybody who was a citizen of the United States could work and did work, we'd still be short about 4 million people to fill all the jobs that are needed. And it's not unique to us. It's the same problem with most of the major industrialized nations because of the low birth rate. But what would you suggest that we could do to solve that problem?
I am so glad you asked that question. I'm an economist by training, and I think that one of my pet ideas is that we make it part of the job of the Federal Reserve, which they have study centers all over the country, have them come up with forecasts of what our economy needs to be at something approaching full employment, how many visas should we give out? Make it based on economic need, not based on, right now it's not based on anything. I mean, I think enlightened self-interest would be a really big step forward for this country when it comes to visas. That would be my solution. I think that our decisions should be made substantially on the basis of economics, and then I think there's other decisions that should be based on humanitarian concerns. I think we have a responsibility to welcome refugees to some degree. We can argue about that.
So what do you attribute all this antipathy toward refugees? I mean, we're all descended from, or toward immigrants. I mean, we're all descended from immigrants here, unless we're natives. It seems like this is all kind of a recent thing. It's not.
I think it's recent, but it's also something that we've gone through many cycles of as a country. We go back and forth from being rather noble and open to being quite harshly closed. And we've gone through that cycle many times, and we're in a harshly closed time right now, and particularly so. But I find that if you tell people the stories, they come around. I've not experienced hostility once I get a chance to talk with people and hear their talks. I did have a guy very hostile come to a talk that I gave in, in Gays Mills or something. And he was really, really angry because he'd lived at the border and he had difficult problems with people crossing the border around his property. And I listened to him for about 15 minutes and was like, yeah, that's really hard. You are a victim of our policies too. Yeah, it's not working for you either. I get it. And by the end of the conversation, he was, how shall I put it? His heart was soft. He was ready to hear that other people too were suffering and that our policies didn't have to hurt other people in order to save him. We could do better than that.
I thank you for being here and doing what you do. I've housed 4 refugees in the last 2 years. One is a transgender from Africa, and they're here legally, but I'm concerned about them. If she goes back home, he or she will be put to death. That is one reason why they left the country. And I have one living with me now for the last 4 months. And, my thing is, I'm afraid for all of them. And I say, do not answer the door, don't talk to strangers. And then I see on the news today, people who get picked up by people with no uniforms, no arrest warrants, and I wonder what kind of a country are we living in? I mean, this is really frightening.
One small thing that you can do, I carry red cards around with me. I don't know if you've heard about those, but there are Know Your Rights cards. You can get them online. And if I see anybody, if I happen to be walking around somewhere and I see anybody who looks like maybe they're an immigrant, I'll just hand them a couple cards and say, I don't need to know anything about you, but if this would be of interest to anybody you know, and I don't even assume it's for them, anybody you know.
But even the level of anxiety that they
Yes, it's a lot of anxiety. Yes, I don't know anybody who feels confident right now. I mean, even the person living with us who has asylum, she has plenty of fear.
Ironically, on our way to TriCon, we received a phone call from someone who defected in 1957 from Hungary when they were taken over by Russia after World War II, and he reached out to us. His older brother has already written a book, Bela Shuhaida, and this is his younger brother, Kozlov, who was a couple years younger, but the same story. But they came into New Jersey, and then actually our Rotary Club brought him up to the Upper Peninsula in Ishpeming, and he learned how to read and write at the Carnegie Library in Ishpeming by Mrs. Volker. And he wants to come up and give a talk at our Rotary. And his older brother has already done that. They've both written books. It's just kind of a correlation that it's like, wow, and Rotary was involved in this stuff, many years ago, over 50 years ago, we were doing this stuff. So, it's just kind of neat how ironic that happened on our way driving here, carpooling from the UP. So anyway, I just want to show that.
I'm trying to catch people in order that you've raised your hand, and we have about 11 minutes left.
thank you for your compelling message. I don't know how you keep one foot in front of the other. So it's gone back and forth, and I don't think the time is right at the moment, but in the past we've invested money in their homelands so that the people who didn't want to walk through the jungle and be raped and camp on the border for 2 years didn't have to leave their homes. Is there a role for Rotary to help the countries they're coming from, make it easier for them to stay? And the other part is a question about population pressures, birth control, and women's autonomies. Would that help?
I'd like to address the first one first. I mean, I think what Rotary is already doing in places like Guatemala is exactly the kind of stuff that needs to be done. I think it really does help. Some of it is economic development. Some of it is cultural, and we have to be humble about our. I mean, we don't have much power over the culture that, for example, would put somebody who's trans to death. Right? That's not something that people from the United States can change for another country. They need to decide for themselves that they want to change that. And I think we have plenty of reasons to be humble ourselves for all sorts of problems that we have.
Sure.
I think, and we used to do more, we used to do a lot more foreign aid than we do right now. It's actually a very tiny part of our budget, even before the ending of USAID. Most Americans think, if you talk to poll people, they think we spend something like 20% of our federal budget on foreign aid. It's like less than 1%. Yeah. So that's not a big thing. But I will say that one of Biden's policies that I liked, I think it was his best executive order for immigration, was that he set up asylum processing centers right near some of the hotspots in adjacent countries. So you could leave Venezuela and go to a processing center in Ecuador and apply for asylum from there. And he at least prevented many people, I want to say it was 750,000 people, came into the country under that policy without having to cross the Darien Gap and Mexico and walk across the border. They were able to come in on commercial flights with permission to seek asylum from within the United States. That was cheaper than a lot of Border Patrol stuff, than beefing up the border. It was a much more efficient use of resources if what we want to do is vet people before they come. And it certainly saved lives to prevent them from making that journey. I think that would be a good way to go again. Yeah, thank you.
And the other question?
I wonder if I should take a different one back there. Sorry.
Yes. I came from Panama. I was born in the Republic of Panama. I'm a citizen now because the first time, my husband was from Germany, and the first time we went to Germany, I didn't get a passport to travel because I could not get a birth certificate because I was born in a very small village in Panama. And the records were kept in the church of the village. The church burned down, and so did everybody's birth certificates. So as far as Panama knows, I don't exist at all. I'm a citizen here. When we came back from Germany, I became a citizen. And what I really wanted to say is that the first few years that I was here, there was a requirement that every non-citizen immigrant had to register. Every January, we had to register, go to the post office, pick up the papers, fill them out, and then pass them on, and we were registered citizens, not citizens, but we live here in the States with permission. And, I asked my daughter when it came up that all these immigration things, getting rid of the immigrants, I asked her, what about you guys? Your dad and I were not citizens when you guys were born, we all going to be evacuated from here? And she said, no, you were here with permission. We were here under quotas. So, yeah, I just wanted to give that information.
I think one of the hard things right now is that there's so much confusion about what is and isn't legal because so many of the executive orders have been legally ambiguous and they seem to be, in some cases, unconstitutional or violate other laws, and it's just very confusing to know how it's going to play out. Thank you for the story.
Question, but for people who are wondering what else you can tell people why they don't do it legally, people don't realize that it's anywhere from like $150 to $300 to apply for a visa, and if they don't get it, they lose their money. So people making $2 a day, think about what they have to do. So that's another reason it's not legal. But my question is, honestly, you made a comment about even naturalized citizens potentially having to carry all their documents.
Yeah.
Mom is a naturalized citizen who just talked to you,
Yeah.
and we're going to Canada to the convention. Do I need to take more than a passport for her?
I would think a passport would do you fine, yeah, yeah. And I'm not, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not the one to ask about that, but the reason I bring it up, that I said that even if you were a naturalized citizen, you might want to keep your papers with you, is because it's illegal not to have proof, and you got to have your proof easily obtainable. And what we're seeing is that they're not even waiting for people to say, well, I have this at home. I mean, they're just taking people. So it just seems like it's just a really risky situation for a lot of people, even if you are absolutely here legally and can ultimately prove it. You might go through some hassle before you do.
Just one quick comment. The Constitution says that all persons in the United States deserve due process. It doesn't say all immigrant or all non-immigrants. It doesn't say all citizens. It says all persons. The current administration has violated that constitutional right in deporting citizens to not Nicaragua, El Salvador. If due process is not available to them, if it's not guaranteed to them, it's not guaranteed to any of us. It's either all of us or none of us.
This is going to be our last question.
Can you give us a little information? There was a proposal before Congress about immigration that was proposed by the Biden administration. It looked like it was going to pass. What would that have done for immigrants?
It would have, well, first I'll say what it would have done for voters. It would have outraged everybody. I think it was probably about the best we could do as a bipartisan bill. It really did have something to please and outrage everybody in it. It was the most conservative bill that probably could have passed in about the last 30 years. And it's kind of ironic that it ultimately was not even brought to a vote after it passed the Senate, because it would have achieved so much that I would say in general conservatives have wanted for a long time. And we ended up not getting that reform at all. It would have given a lot of things that a lot of conservatives have wanted. It would have also given liberals some things that they wanted. It was really a missed opportunity. It's unfortunate, although there were things in it that gave me heartburn. It also, we need to come together as a country, and even that law would be much, much better than the absence of that law. It would have brought us clarity. And I think it would have brought, like businesses want clarity and predictability, so do immigrants. It would have clarified many things.
Okay. So I don't get in trouble for running over.
Forgiven.
In Rotary, you ask for forgiveness.
All right.
Cocktail hour. We can listen to her for a little longer.
Okay, I was just going to ask, are you willing to hang out?
I am willing to hang out, and anybody who wants to leave, I won't think you're rude. Go ahead and leave.
I just want to thank Kat for joining us today and sharing with us. And thank you to our workshop sponsor, Barry Consiglio, Zvansky Heinz Group. That was a mouthful. Thank you everyone for attending today. Kat said she'd hang out.
Thank you. Thank you.